Hello, welcome to this evening's Hands Lecture, the 23rd Hands Lecture, in fact. This is our annual lecture at Mansfield College, where I'm the principal, about politics, economics, current affairs. It's a lecture, sometimes it's a conversation. Tonight we're going to have a conversation. Our 23rd Hands Lecture, Baroness Warsi, follows a long line of exceptionally distinguished predecessors who include Lord David Blunkett, Sir Malcolm Rifkin, Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, the late President Jimmy Carter, the late Lord Ashdown, I'm going to go on for a bit, the former President of New Zealand, Helen Clark, Sir Bob Geldof, and Michael Heseltine, and the former Vice President of the Afghan Parliament and women's rights advocate, Fawzia Koofi. I'm going to mention two more before I stop. No, not three. I'm going to mention William Hague, our new Chancellor, and Baroness Warsi's former boss, who would be here, but it's his wife's birthday. Sayeeda's former colleague at Operation Black Vote, Lord Simon Woolley, and our Mansfield alum and now Minister of State for Media, Tourism and Creative Industries, Sir Chris Bryant. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to give some particular thanks to Guy and Julia Hands, who are two of Mansfield's longest standing and most generous supporters, for whom this lecture series is named. The longevity of a Hands lecture reflects Guy and Julia's own incredible commitment to this college, and their support and inspiration for our long-standing commitment to championing and modelling fair access to academic excellence has been a vital source of strength and pride to Mansfield, and we've become a beacon in the sector and the world for social mobility and for widening participation in education and public life. And we're very proud of that, and we're very proud of the support we've had from Guy and Julia for that. So as I look forward to the next chapter in Mansfield's evolution, I am grateful to both Guy and Julia for their continued support and the opportunities that they help us to open up for our wonderful Mansfield students. And they also serve as an inspiration to the next generation of Mansfield's philanthropists. I know that because they tell me. Guy and Julia are, I think, joining remotely this year, so we're live streaming to them. So hello, Guy and Julia. Thank you always for your championing of Mansfield. And now I'm going to start and talk about tonight's speaker, Baroness Sayeeda Warsi. Sayeeda Baroness Warsi was Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister at the age of 36, which I remember making me feel old when I was 40 and you were a cabinet minister and you were 36. She's also a lawyer, a businesswoman, and a racial justice campaigner. She's been consistently listed in the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. And as I've said, she was appointed to the House of Lords as a live peer at the age of 36 in 2010, when she was the co-chairwoman of the Conservative Party and then Minister of State for Faith and Communities and Senior Minister of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. She resigned from the Cabinet in August 2014 over her disagreement with the government's policy relating to the Israel-Gaza conflict, and in September 2024 she resigned the whip and left the Conservative Party. And she's now a regular TV presenter and news commentator. She's advisor to the Bridge Institute at Georgetown University and the University of Notre Dame. She's Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Bolton, and she's got 4 honorary doctorates. Dr. Baroness Warsi. And she's the author of 2 books. One is called The Enemy Within, A Tale of Muslim Britain, which she wrote in 2017. And then this year's book, for which copies are available from all good booksellers, but signed ones are available outside after the talk, which is called Muslims Don't Matter. And she has also recently launched into the world of podcasting with her award-winning podcast with David Baddiel, A Muslim and a Jew Go There, which I really recommend. It made my daughter, who claims not to be interested in politics, say how interesting it was and how interested she was. So thank you very much for that. So I'm delighted to welcome Baroness Warsi for our conversation tonight. And she's going to talk tonight about whose voices matter, for which her book title might be a bit of a spoiler alert. Muslims Don't Matter. But can I start by asking a bit about you? As I've said, Mansfield really prides itself on championing and welcoming smart people from a very wide range of social backgrounds. Can you tell us about your background and early education?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Helen. We politicians love coming to these events because you get these great, lovely introductions where people read out these huge accolades. But you forgot the one that I really think you should have mentioned.
Sorry.
And that was that at the age of 36, when I was introduced to the House of Lords, I was voted the sexiest member of the House of Lords.
I'm really sorry. That's really
Well, William wasn't in the House then, so maybe I would have had competition then. But thank you very much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for hosting me.
Can I just say someone could change Wikipedia this very day, because that wasn't in Wikipedia, but it should be.
I suppose for me, my upbringing was what I would define as a typical Yorkshire working class migrant upbringing. So I'm born in 71, one of 5 girls. When I was born, Dad was working in the mills. He was part of the trade union movement. And he had arrived here about 8 years before I was born. And my grandfather had arrived here about 4 years before then in 1958. And I suppose in many ways there were lots of different parts of my identity which started to frame who I was to eventually become, even in those early days. But I think probably 2 of the most powerful parts of my identity were, first of all, a kind of a Yorkshire working class upbringing. Occasionally people will say to me, you know, you can be difficult. And I said, no, I'm just being from Yorkshire. You know, you come there, most of us are just straight and difficult. And it's not difficult, we just tell you as it is. But also I think the second part of it was coming from an all-female family. The second of 5 girls. In a society, both kind of culturally, but also generally in Britain at the time, where to be a female child was still considered to be not as good as the boys. And I think one of the things that I heard very strongly when I was growing up from my mum was that we had to be as good as the boys. So there was, I suppose in many ways, I did grow up with a bit of a chip on my shoulder quite early on, with a sense of having to prove ourselves. And you know, I always say that as a girl, in many ways, you're born on the wrong side of the balance sheet. You know, boys are considered to be providers. Girls were seen, certainly in those days, as takers. Boys are seen as being assets. Girls were seen as being liabilities. Boys were seen as carrying honor. Girls were seen as carrying shame. And so right from day one, I think there was this sense of, I need to be on the other side of the balance sheet, without realizing actually the whole point of the boys and the girls was to have a sense of balance in society. So I think the fight was there very early on, and the sense of wanting to achieve something, and the sense of wanting for life to be better than what we were born into. And I think all of these things kind of shaped me early on, and certainly during my teenage years, I would say framed what I became, which was a racial justice campaigner, this sense of unfairness that I felt, that there were ways in which I was being treated and expectations that people had of me, or lack of expectations people had of me, because of the colour of my skin. And I explore a lot of this, I think, in my first book, where I say that, you know, identity for me growing up, the point of difference was really race rather than religion.
Yeah. And you were Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister in 2010, and I remember, and some of my younger Muslim colleagues who were children at the time have been talking about, they remember you walking down Downing Street and your pink salwar kameez, looking young, and obviously the sexiest member of the House of Lords. What brought you to that role? It doesn't sound like a kind of something you might expect from your background, and also from the things that drove you as a younger woman.
Yeah. I think there were, I mean, I was born in a generation where I had, you know, parents who absolutely believed we could be anything. And I had the ultimate kind of tiger mom early on. And I was born into a generation of Asian women where both your husband and your career were chosen by your mother. And so very early on, she kind of sat us all down, all 5 of us, and she decided what we were going to be. I mean, she literally went lawyer, accountant, doctor, pharmacist, and that's what you did. And I was given law, which I suppose worked for me. And I think that kind of set off the journey for me in terms of what eventually then ended up at the political kind of cabinet table. I was always involved in politics. So I was part of the Students' Union political movement. I was vice president of the Students' Union at college. And to some extent, I think party politics was something that I naturally then fell into in my late 20s, and then eventually found myself fighting a seat, and then eventually found myself in the House of Lords. But I think that for me, every step of the way has always been a platform. So whether that was as a lawyer, which is what I first qualified as, and then went on to set up my own practice, it was a platform to try and make change happen. Politics was a platform to try and make change happen. TV now is a platform to try and make change happen. Parliament is a space, a platform to try and make change happen. I think for me, throughout life, these have been privileges and opportunities to try and pull the levers for change to happen.
And that cabinet, that coalition cabinet between 2010 and 2014, when you left it, I remember when that cabinet was formed being outraged, because I've got plenty of privilege from my education too, but I remember being outraged that there were more men from the Oxford College I went to, many of whom were contemporaries of mine, than there were women in that cabinet. And you were the first Muslim woman, and you were from a working class family, and you were Northern. What was that like? And could you make change happen?
I think there were so many emotions that ran through my mind at that moment. When you are appointed to cabinet, there's this surreal moment where the Prime Minister invites you in. And because it was a coalition cabinet, and cabinet wasn't formed immediately the day after the election, it took days and days for all this negotiating to happen about the coalition agreement. And we didn't know whether Gordon Brown was going to stand down, whether he was going to try and form a government with the Lib Dems, whether we were going to form government with the Lib Dems. So when I finally got that call days later, I was actually in John Lewis buying tights. And I remember getting the call thinking, yeah, the kind of regular day-to-day goes on. And I got a call and said, you know, the Prime Minister would like to see you. So I kind of trotted off to Downing Street. And then you're invited into the cabinet room, and there's this huge cabinet table, and you sit at one end, and the Prime Minister sits at the other. It's very Putinesque. And and the Prime Minister then tells you what job he wants you to do. And David Cameron said, look, you know, I'd like you to join the cabinet. I said, thank you, Prime Minister. And he said, I'd like you to become Minister without portfolio, Cabinet Minister without portfolio, and Conservative Party Chairman. And my dad, who is like a frantic migrant dad, you know, constantly wants to know every aspect of your life, had been ringing me as soon as I told him I was on my way to Downing Street. I came out, I had like 60 missed calls off Dad. He said, well, what job are you doing? And I said, well, it's Cabinet Minister without portfolio. And he said, well, what kind of job is that? I can't tell anybody what kind of job that is. Does that even sound like a job? And so my kind of first instinct was, what can I tell my dad so he can announce it to his tribe about how wonderful his daughter is? And then my second kind of sense was just being completely overwhelmed that did I imagine that this moment would ever come for a working class girl from Dewsbury. So there was that sense. But I also think that even though most of that cabinet were not educated in a comprehensive like I was and didn't come from working class roots, and were not from Yorkshire and were not from migrant backgrounds. In fact, I was the only non-white member of that cabinet. I still felt that because there were people who I had spent a lot of time working with, and we'd worked through ideas, I felt like we were all on the same page. And I think that the Liberal Democrats joining us also made us nicer. And so I always say about that coalition, cabinet, we made the Liberal Democrats more practical and they made us slightly more compassionate. And so in that sense, I think there was an interesting dynamic in that cabinet. And I genuinely don't think I ever felt like an outsider. I mean, this is an interesting subject for me, Helen. We've talked about it briefly in the past where, I dealt with it earlier, a couple of weeks ago in a lecture that I delivered, the Hennessy lecture, where, has diversity served its purpose? We had, until this latest government was formed, probably one of the most diverse cabinets that we've ever had in history. We've had, my party, oh, by the way, I don't know whether this is going to make you happier or more sad, I am still a member of the Conservative Party.
Oh, you are?
Yeah,
well, Wikipedia says you're
so
not.
I have Wikipedia needs to be amended. Somebody needs to go and amend Wikipedia. But I have relinquished my whip, so I do not vote with the Conservatives in the House of Lords, but I still remain a party member for now. And I think that, for me, I felt that some of the progress that we've made within the Conservative Party, look, there's no doubt that we've made huge progress. You know, we've had every major office of state being held by somebody from a diverse background, or now 2 female prime ministers, well, actually 2.5 female prime ministers. And so I think that we've had so much kind of diversity in so many ways, but has it actually delivered an understanding of today's Britain? And there's a comedian who does this fabulous sketch, very obviously inappropriate and tongue-in-cheek, but he does this whole sketch about it's time to make politics white again, because diversity hasn't served as well. I just think that we need to, sometimes we get obsessed about diversity in ways without understanding that diversity is not just about skin colour and not just about gender. Actually, it's also about diversity of thought. And sitting around the cabinet table with the likes of Ken Clarke and Dominic Grieve and William Hague and David Willis and Justin Greening was probably in many ways much more diverse in terms of its thought and understanding of what Britain is and has been and should be than I think often sometimes, you know, sitting around with people who may actually, you know, have the same race as you or the same religion as you or the same gender as you.
Okay. But you've talked in your podcast about leaving that role and saying, look, this isn't something that someone, presumably, what did you tell your dad when you left the cabinet? That's not in your books, that's why I asked.
Actually, both of the books don't deal with me very much. I think that the issue of the tale of Muslim Britain and the story of Muslims within Britain and Britain's relationship with Islam and its Muslims and the way in which policy making has been done is far more interesting than an individual story. Yeah. When I told my dad that I had decided to resign, so I come from a business family. We used to manufacture. The family mainly manufacture furniture, and so before I came into politics, I'd been involved in the family business. And Dad, in his typical kind of Yorkshire way, when I said to him, "Look, I'm resigning, and this is the reason why I'm resigning," he said, "Well, I've cleaned down your office. It's time for you to get back on the shop floor." And I think it's probably the best thing he could have said to me. He didn't make a big song and dance about it. He said, you have to be comfortable with the decisions that you make. And now you need to get back because some beds need to be made. So, you know, it was kind of probably a good way of breaking from this hedonistic world that politics is back to actually making real things in a Yorkshire factory.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk then about the subject of your book and the voices that matter. One of the things that you've talked about from your childhood, your generation, is that when you grew up, you were aware of race discrimination. You were aware of people who might hold it against you what your skin colour was, but you weren't really aware of Islam as a kind of political identity or being a Muslim as something that people were going to treat you as any differently from any other kid whose skin wasn't white, frankly. So But when you start your book, the first chapter, which is very powerful, which is called Buying Diamonds, because of the sense that do you actually feel safe in this country anymore as a Muslim? Should you have an escape plan, a plan B? You feel that there is now really strong discrimination against Muslims. You're seen as fair game. What happened? What happened between your childhood, my childhood, and now?
I think there are two parts to this, Helen. First of all, I think the way in which the Muslim identity was politicised, and that became the identity through which you were identified, was something that happened over a period of time through the 90s, the kind of noughties, and how that progressed. And it's predominantly actually what I track in my first book. How did I stop becoming an Asian, a brown person, just an Asian brown person, to becoming a British Muslim? And how did that identity frame itself? And there are all sorts of kind of trigger moments when that identity starts to become more and more pronounced. But I think in terms of the book, this book, this is probably I always say it's my heartbreak letter, right? Because about a year ago, it was literally February last year, when my husband and I regularly go for walks. There's a lovely place called Nostell Priory around the corner from where we live in Wakefield. And we were on one of our regular walks, and we walked up to the coffee shop. And as we sat down, I said to him, I'm one of 5, and one of 3 of them have now bought homes elsewhere. They call them their sanctuary homes, and overseas. And I said, sister number 3 has just bought a home. That's 3 out of 5 now. And are we going to be that family, like that Jewish family in the 1930s, who poo-pooed their family and friends and said, don't be so daft. We're so well established. I'm a member of the House of Lords. I'm a Privy Councillor. I'm an ex-cabinet minister. I have 2 grandfathers. My paternal and maternal grandfather both served in the British Indian Army. He came here afterwards. My dad worked in the mills, helped rebuild this country after the Second World War. My only born child is back in uniform, back in our armed forces, defending our country as I speak. Don't be so daft. We're going to be all right. This is our country. We've helped build it, defend it, protect it, make it. And I said, I can say all of that. It sounds great. And I can believe it. But do I really believe it? And why is everybody around me making exit routes? Why are they planning exit routes? Why have they got plan Bs in place? Why are some of our most successful friends looking elsewhere? Why are their kids studying in other places? Why are they finding alternative citizenships? These are all red flags. And are we going to be the couple that couldn't see it coming, even though we were the closest to be able to see it coming? And then we sat in silence for a while. And I came home and I felt helpless and heartbroken. And I thought the least I can do is document this period. The least I can do is tell people how I feel in my country. And so, the first couple of pages are written like a post-50 menopausal woman. I mean, those of you who are post-50 and menopausal will know it starts with, I'm done. I'm done with explaining, I'm done with justifying, I'm done with caveating, I'm done with condemning. I am done. I am done with being told how grateful I have to be to live in my own country, and somehow that correlates with the darker the pigment in my skin. I'm done with having to constantly be accountable collectively for any bad Muslim anywhere in the world. I'm done with explaining every verse of a 7th century religious text. I'm done. And having got that off my chest, I then spend chapter after chapter after chapter explaining why I'm done. The lawyer in me then kicks in and then says, and let me tell you why. Let me tell you why in culture and in art and in politics and in media and in think tanks and in the law and in all these different ways, let me tell you how time and time again Muslims don't matter. And it's heartbreaking because I've just finished writing the extra chapter for the paper bag. And my editor was saying, do you feel like there's anything optimistic you have to say? And that chapter is called Postmortem. And it's basically a postmortem of what happened in the summer and the riots, the election of Trump, the rise of the oligarchy, the overt anti-Muslim sentiments that we're now seeing, the fallout of the war in Israel and Palestine. And I'm not hopeful, but I will fight for my rightful place in my country. And in that fight, I suppose part of, you know, why these moments are important is because it's a call for allyship. To say this cannot be how it ends. 70 years on, this is not how it should end.
Yeah. I'm going to try to get us back on the barricades and feeling at least some sense of agency later on in the talk, where I'll talk about what we can do and the kind of allyship. But I just wanted to take you back, because the statistics are pretty depressing, and this is before the latest round of bashing and global politics. But your book talks about a report from the University of Birmingham in 2022, which is pretty depressing about the concept of racism altogether. But Muslims are the most demonised minority group apart from gypsies and travellers in this country. 25.9% of British people feel negative towards Muslims, compared with 8.5% who are prepared to say they feel negative towards Jews, and 6.4% who say they're prepared to feel negative towards black people. And one of the things you talk about in your book is how this kind of comes from the top, as you say, from think tanks and media and respectable people. And you talk about the dinner party test. Do you want to talk a bit about that? What do you mean? How does this become respectable?
Yeah, growing up, the kind of racism that I and many others faced was, excuse the term, but this is what it was called. It was called packy bashing. You got beat up by somebody who looked like a racist. You know, it was usually some thug. It was known as the skinheads at the time, would be dressed in a certain way, would have a certain attitude. You knew what you were dealing with. And in some ways, that individual was probably living all the tough lives that you were living in working class Yorkshire. And even though that was more brutal and more violent, it was easier to deal with. The dinner table test talks about what I call respectable racism. It's the kind of conversations that happen around the tables of liberal, intelligent society, where they say things like, we've had a Muslim family move in next door, and they're ever so nice. I even saw the husband carry her bags in the other day. And this kind of assumption about stereotypes about Muslims, their men are misogynistic, their men are sexual predators, their women are traditionally submissive, they're violent, they're uniquely non-integrationist, all of this stuff that we, you know, tropes that we have about Muslim communities. And I saw this in the corridors of power. I saw this in think tanks. I saw this in media rooms. I would sit in conversations where people would talk about Islam, not having had any expertise on the subject. Everybody's an expert, by the way, on Islam. And so would talk about these issues in the most appalling ways. And then, because I would be, on most occasions, the only Muslim in the room, would then turn to me and say, but of course Islam is a peaceful religion. I'm like, you can't make that one statement and that kind of outdoes everything you've said before then. And it was just this kind of pernicious form of everyday racism. But what made this far worse than the packy bashing was that this was people in positions of power. Like little Johnny, who smacked you at the end of a school day, had about as much power as you had in the end, and probably is living some miserable life somewhere in Yorkshire right now. But the people who were exercising this form of racism within politics and think tanks and media were people with positions of power. And so they could really damage your lives in ways that little Johnny couldn't. And so one of the things I talk about a lot, it's an offensive term, so I hope you're not offended by it, but I always say, you know, smack me in the face and call me a packy, I'll take that any day. But don't do this respectable rubbish that I see in politics from so-called intelligent people who couch their racism in all sorts of conversations around free speech, for example. That's one of the ones we like to talk about. Free speech. Let's talk about free speech. It's because Muslims are uniquely not wanting to have free speech until Muslims exercise their right to free speech, and then we try and shut it down. Or democracy. Muslims don't believe in democratic nations, but when they exercise their democratic right and elect 4 members of parliament who are independent in these constituencies with large Muslim communities, we don't like that kind of democracy. Not that kind. So I think it's this constant use of double standards that I see in politics. And then, you know, citizenship stripping, Helen. right? That most appalling of decisions that we took in this country, where we effectively told somebody who was born, raised a British national, had never been anything but a British national, had never attempted to take on any other citizenship but a British citizenship, who was potentially, probably entitled to apply for another citizenship, Bangladesh, but Bangladesh made it clear that even if she did apply for this citizenship, she would not be granted it. And by the way, if they'd left it another year or so, she wouldn't have even had the option to exercise this citizenship. We're talking here about Shamima Begum, who actually at the age of 15 was groomed. And whether she's a sinner or a saint, I'm not making a judgment on that, but she's our sinner or our saint. And for us to do what we did effectively, to quote of all people, my colleague Jacob Rees-Mogg, we created 2 categories of citizenship in this country. We told a whole load of people, you know your place. You live here at our pleasure. You hold your citizenship to our pleasure. And that, I think, was a schism at a moment where it basically said, this is not permanent. My place in my country is not permanent. And I give this example very, very personally. So my child who serves at the moment, who is now 5th generation British in country, but obviously British for many hundreds of years before then as part of the British Indian Empire, still could, through a default of heritage and birth of her great-grandfather, potentially, probably, apply for a citizenship somewhere in South Asia. That means that if she was to commit a crime and your daughter was to commit the same crime, your daughter would be imprisoned, mine could be potentially stripped of her citizenship and sent off these
Mine
lands.
probably could too, because she's entitled to Irish citizenship, but I bet she wouldn't be. Because what you're talking about is exceptionalism, and the other kind of exceptionalism which has been weaponised very effectively, I think, against Muslims is the narrative around grooming gangs because of policing decisions concerning some very high-profile grooming gangs. But again, I've seen in this university, Matt Goodwin, a former academic at the University of Kent, so-called, just asserting as a fact that grooming gangs are disproportionately Muslim. And I was Googling frantically during his talk. It's in your book, the statistic. That can't be true. It's not true. 89%, the Home Office statistics suggest 89% of people who are found, suspected of child abuse are white, 6% are Asian origin, all Asian origin, 3% are black. So actually disproportionately white. How do these narratives take hold?
Yeah, the child sexual exploitation, paedophilia stuff is as somebody who's both prosecuted and defended, as a criminal defence lawyer, I have, represented everybody from, police officers to religious leaders to school teachers to, unfortunately, sexual abuse tragically occurs in every aspect of society. It occurs in, churches, it occurs in mosques and gurdwaras, it occurs within sports centres, it occurs in football coaches, it occurs in Hollywood, it occurs in TV. We've seen it everywhere. But what we've done over the years is we've made this a particular crime because it's to do with a particular community. Renée Edo-Lodge, actually, who wrote Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, says, fascinatingly, she says, why is it that when black men or brown men commit a crime, it's somehow a reflection of their blackness and their brownness, but when white men commit the same crime, it's got nothing to do with their race, it's just criminality. And I think we need to unwind this to what this is. First of all, paedophilia and child sexual abuse is an abhorrent crime. And it doesn't matter who the perpetrator is, the main focus of that should be the victims. Secondly, those people who now, and for somebody who actually has followed this very closely for over a decade and has spoken about it publicly, and again in the new chapter, I list all the people who back in 2010, 11, 12 were at the forefront of challenging this stuff and trying to make sure that the victims got justice. And interestingly, over and over again, you found that these people were British Muslim and British Asian who were leading these campaigns. People like Nazir Afzal, who prosecuted this, people like Shaista Gohar, who was putting the reports out, people who were reporting on it at the time. I spoke about it at the time. I started a whole series of initiatives within government about it at the time, but that's not a story that, you know, unfortunately the newspapers and the media like to tell. But it's an abhorrent crime. But what's fascinating is that when you actually break this down into statistics, there is no over-representation of a particular religious identity or a particular racial identity when it comes to child abuse. First of all, child abuse is most likely to occur in the home. Most children that are abused in this country are abused by either a father or an uncle or a close family friend. It is somebody, and it's, you know, overwhelmingly men, but it's immediate family. Secondly, if you look at the child abuse overall, it is overwhelmingly committed by white men. Thirdly, if you look at gang-based violence, again, there is no over-representation of Muslim communities. However, if you say we are looking at only child abuse that relates to certain towns where there is an overpopulation of certain communities, and it is committed by men who work in the nighttime economy, i.e. takeaways and taxi owners, and you kind of narrow it down to that particular kind of crime, then of course you've got overrepresentation of men who work in the nighttime economy, which is predominantly Asian men from certain communities. And the Home Office commissioned a report on this to try and get to the bottom of all of this. And they took out statistics of convictions, statistics of arrests. They took all these various statistics to work out whether there was a correlation between this overrepresentation story. And it turned out that there wasn't. And 3 successive Home Secretaries buried that report. And it took the use of an information commission and a Freedom of Information Act, and then the Information Commissioner intervened, and then there was a public petition, and then finally that report was released. I mean, it literally had to be dragged out of government, kicking and screaming. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, that if a report doesn't prove that actually this group is overrepresented, why was there no desire to actually publish that report and put the record straight? Why was the misinformation allowed to filter?
And why do you think that is?
Because it didn't suit the narrative.
But one of these Home Secretaries was Sajid Javid.
Absolutely, and I talk about him in a lot of detail here.
You know,
I talk about them in a lot of detail here because, and this is the point that I was making early on, that, you know, diversity, and this is interestingly found across the world, that in the right of politics, unfortunately, if you are a politician from a diverse background and you are prepared to pander to racism and punch down, there is political benefit in that. So in the end, it's political benefit.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, and I'm going to throw it open because I'm sure other people have a lot of questions they want to ask you. So one of them is, you talk about the acceptability of anti-Islamic prejudice. But one of the things, and you and David Baddiel talk about this on your podcast, A Muslim and a Jew Go There, is that if you're talking about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and you're talking about in the context of the Gaza conflict, which has blown up relationships between people in this university, in this town, all over the country, all over the world, really. People may say, yes, but the difference between prejudice against Muslims or Jews and other forms of racial prejudice is, this is about ideas. This isn't about your skin colour or your sex or something you can't help. This is about an idea, which is a chosen thing, and I don't like these ideas. I don't like Zionism, or I don't like traditional Muslim views of women, or whatever it is. I mean, how do you counter that?
I don't think you should counter it. I mean, if you are going to argue that you don't like Zionism and you're going to dissect that, you have the right to do that. It's a political ideology. If you want to dissect Islamism and you want to dissect that, you have a right to do that. It's an ideology. I mean, both of them are ideologies. And you can't protect an ideology. Just with religion, we don't protect religion in this country. We don't have blasphemy laws, thankfully. And therefore, you don't go around saying, well, these ideas are so sacred that they can't be touched. And interestingly, even as somebody who was born and raised a Muslim, actually in a very pluralistic Islamic home, the idea of debate, discussion, disagreement was an essential part of being a Muslim. So I come from a mixed Sunni Shia heritage. We were brought up in all sorts of interesting religious Islamic teachings. And my mum and dad would say, if it makes sense, follow it. If it doesn't, don't. You know, and if it doesn't make sense to you, well, then go away and investigate it and ask questions. So the idea that you blindly follow, or that religion without reason should even exist, is away with the fairies. And so, interestingly, this kind of issue of constant debate and discussion is an intrinsic part of Islamic traditional teachings. And so I make this consistently clear that when we talk about anti-Muslim racism, we don't talk about Islam, or or ideologies or religion. We talk about people. And interestingly, anti-Muslim racism isn't always directed at Muslims. A lot of Sikhs get beat up because, unfortunately, most people who are racist aren't always intelligent. And so they will beat up Sikhs thinking they're Muslims, or they will attack gurdwaras thinking that they're mosques. Or some of the most horrific attacks some of the most horrific anti-Muslim attacks in this country haven't even involved Muslim victims. And we've seen recently, haven't we, over the last few days, where there've been a couple of attacks by Israelis on individuals who they thought to be Palestinian, and they turned out to be Israeli. So there's been 2 incidents literally in the last 7 days where this has happened. So I think it's really interesting that you break this down into what anti-Muslim racism is. Anti-Muslim racism is the stigmatization, the stereotyping of a whole community, putting tropes on that community, and then basically saying you all bear this single characteristics. It's taking away the diversity and the plurality within a community and making it into this monolithic block, and then making it accountable for any of the actions that we perceive to be Muslim beliefs. And so I don't think there is any conflict between freedom of expression and freedom of belief in that way, because I think we've always managed to find that space. What I do say, though, often, and people will say, well, can I burn a Quran? And I'm like, well, yeah, if that's what gets you kicks, I mean, I think there's better things to do, but if that's what floats your boat, that's what you like to do. I call it the farting on the bus test, right? You can fart on the bus. You try not to do it. It's not very nice. It's not against the law, but it's quite offensive. And if you're the kind of person who gets the kicks about farting on a bus, fine, that's you, right? But it's not me. It's not and I think a civilized society is one that doesn't choose to do things because it can, but actually finds a way in which they find a sense of ease. And that's why I take great issue with people in politics who project as patriots, Helen. People who say, I love my country and I hate everything about it. Well, that's not very patriotic. I love my country and they shouldn't be here and they're the other and they don't belong, and setting everybody against one another, creating this sense of unease, effectively setting fires in our own nation. That to me is not patriotism. They are patriots. They're project as patriots, but they're behaving like arsonists. And I think it's time for us to, push back on this, what we can start to see, this othering of communities in the world where the patriot is painted in this tiny box of who belongs and everybody else doesn't.
Okay, I've got lots of other things I want to ask, but I'm not going to because I'm going to ask other people. But what I do want to ask is, I guess your publisher's question was, is there nothing to be cheerful about? To which your answer is not really, it's getting worse. What do you think people of goodwill should be doing? What agency do we have to challenge this, and how should we be going about it?
Okay, so there are 2 different conversations I have. When I speak to predominantly British Muslim audiences, what I say to them is, you are a young, vibrant community. You are overwhelmingly under the age of 30. The sense of entrepreneurship and spirit and art and culture that's coming out of this community at the moment is phenomenal. We have been here before. We've been here before with with the Jewish community, we've been here with the Catholic community, we've been here with women where they were considered not to even have the agency of being able to vote and own their own property. We thought Catholics were disloyal, couldn't come to these great institutions, were considered to be loyal to a papacy overseas. We questioned people from the LGBT community in our armed forces. We didn't feel that they belonged. We've been here before. And at no time when we were here before did the state and those that make policy say, I'm just a misogynist, that's why I won't let women have the vote. No, they gave really rationalized, respectable arguments rooted in principles as to why women were second-class citizens. And as we did with the LGBT community, as we did with Jewish communities, as we did with Catholics. So what I say to them is, we've been here before, we've worked it through before, and we will work it through again. And what you need to do right now as British Muslims is not retreat, but step out. And step out not to defend British Muslim communities, but to defend your country. Because you have to understand what the big challenges in this country are. You're just the canaries in the coal mine. The real challenge here is an attack on democracy itself. And you have to be the people who say, no, this is my country, you don't get to do this. Even though I'm the one under attack right now, I will actually be part of the solution rather than allow you to define me to be part of the problem. When I speak to predominantly non-Muslim communities, what I say to them is that we need allyship. You have privilege. You have privilege when you talk about these issues by not being Muslim. And therefore you don't come across as somebody who's got skin in the game and an agenda on this issue. And I think what you have to say is, we see this. You know, what this book, I hope it does, is it gives you example after example, after example. And what I want people to do is to say, aha, I see this. I see what you mean by this when you say that there's Peter Hain, Lord Hain, who's obviously a huge ex-cabinet minister, Labour cabinet minister, veteran anti-apartheid campaigner. He said, for somebody who knew this stuff really well, you made me stop and think again about this stuff. I learned stuff from this. So I hope people will see the examples and see what I see, and then say, I'm going to step up and I'm going to show allyship on this. What does that look like? Actually reach out to people that you work with and ask them how you can support them. Provide platforms for people to be heard. Question when decisions are being made in your institutions. Apply the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, which, by the way, like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, is a non-legally binding working definition. It's there to support and implement culture change rather than to change the law and to prosecute people. You know, take the Quran experiment. It's one of the things I always ask people to do. The Quran experiment is two pranksters from the Netherlands took a copy of the Bible, took the cover off it, covered it in a copy of a sleeve of the Quran, and then stood around on various street corners in Europe reading out quotes on women and gay rights and all the rest of it. And you'd have all these people, Europeans, saying, oh, well, this is why it's uniquely violent and has no place in European society and is an alien culture, until they take the sleeve off and say it's actually the Bible. And so I just think, put things into context. If you want to have an academic conversation about religious scriptures, fine, but don't take religious scriptures of one scripture out of context and say, well, that's why that's uniquely violent and and has no place in British society. There's a whole load of other things that I talk about in the book as well, and in the first book, as to how you can be allies. But we are actually fighting for the very soul of our country right now. Never has this world been as dangerous as it is right now. Never before have we had this much conflict around the world since the Second World War. Never before have we had money and power so closely aligned as we see right now when we look across at the White House and we see the oligarchy at play, where the rules of the game no longer apply, where an international rules-based order is being trashed, where we are dismantling the very institutions that we put in place after what happened in the Second World War. And, this is not scaremongering. All the evidence is there. It's whether we want to open our eyes and see it.
Okay. I recommend this book. It's an extremely good piece of writing. I think it's a fantastic essay, and it does have a lot of, similarly, I thought I knew this stuff. It's really thought-provoking, and I recommend it. But I'm now going to open up the floor to questions. So if you can wait for the microphone to come, there's a couple on each side. Who's going to start us off? Michelle, with a hand just here. Sorry. There's a microphone. Right, it's coming round the back.
Thank you for that. I've been listening to your book and listening to it with great interest, not just because it's a great topic, but also you read it with such righteous fury. I've actually had to dose myself with it because I get so vicariously angry. I teach literature here, so I'm interested in what you raised about suiting the narrative, changing the narrative. And one of the things in this wide-ranging conversation that we haven't yet broached is this issue of the popular culture, the general culture, literature. In the book you touch on TV. I've been watching Verdi, which features a Sikh married to a Muslim and takes us inside Bradford. So I wondered if you could speak a bit more about that, the cultural and the literary piece.
So there's a whole chapter in the book called Unpopular Culture, which, I go right back to It Ain't Half Hot Mom and Mind Your Language, which was, the kind of basic stuff that we grew up on, and how my mum and dad would watch this and laugh along to it. And now you look back on it, you think, it was so terrible and so stereotypical. It was so... the undercurrents of racism were terrible in those programs, but actually the fact that they felt projected on a screen and reflected on a screen in the 70s was enough for them, just the fact they saw somebody like themselves. But I also talk about how, certainly in Hollywood and Bollywood, there is quite a deliberate, pernicious culture of funding and stereotyping and maligning. And if you look at movies like American Sniper or Black Hawk Down, where, the state support for these was kind of fingerprinted all over these movies, the way in which over time Muslims have been maligned as this kind of slightly, the either misogynist or the angry terrorist, or no agency, no character agency in any of these. And there's some interesting things that I talk about in terms of the RIS test, which is a whole series of tests which are set out as to whether or not there is agency in the Muslim character, and is the character being played out with a sense of both positive and negative portrayal. Is it a wholesome character? So there's some really interesting stuff in there about how popular culture, and then comedy. I talk about how, for example, Sacha Baron Cohen has over the years projected all these really terrible Muslim-esque characters and how it's subtly being done. And then I talk about literature, and I talk about art, and how these kind of subtle messages are constantly being told about Muslim communities, and there's lots of academic work that's been done to support that. Verdi, I love. And I'll tell you why I love it, because my husband and I have binge watched it, like a lot of people watch this stuff, and we felt that the characters were real, and that there was depth to them, and that there was we could see some of our own friends and family and social circle reflected in the complexities of those characters. And I actually think they pitched it right. I mean, they pitched it so interestingly well. And I suppose it was a bit like, I've forgotten the name of it now, the rock band of Muslim women.
Yes.
Yeah, you know which one I'm talking about. It had a season 2 as well. And again, I just thought it was much more real and detailed and nuanced in the way in which those characters were presented. Lady Parts.
Yes.
And Four Lions. I mean, I know that Four Lions was probably one of the first moments where on television, this very genuine, real, complex way of talking about terrorism and extremism, and then real characters in that was done. I remember in government speaking to the then head of MI5, and he said, this is kind of compulsory viewing for all my agents. Because in that, what you see is who they think is the problem and not the problem, and who they don't think is the problem turns out to be the problem. It just shows how complex these issues are. So I think culture is really important, and that's why, there was a report out recently by a think tank called EQUI, which talks about the importance of funding and space and agency around the development of Muslim artists. So I think this is something that is very live, and I think the more we see drama serials like Verdi and others, I think that's better for a much better portrayal of what British Muslims are genuinely living their lives like.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you talk about in your book, and I agree with you about Four Lions, having been a special advocate involved in lots of those cases, it's a realistic film. It's you see some of the pressures on people and how they end up doing what they do. But the other book you talk about is Home Fire, which is Camilla Shamsi's take on the Antigone story, but put through a family with a Islamist brother who, and it's unbelievably realistic.
Yeah.
I mean, I just thought, wow, this is like cases, this is like case notes I've read about, this is extraordinary. As well.
And what was fascinating about Home Fire was she wrote this book in which you end up with a Muslim Home Secretary who has real issues about his own kind of identity, and then he finds himself in a situation with a young person whose citizenship is then stripped. And 9 months later, we saw it play out in real life.
Truth became fiction. No, fiction became truth. Yes, right. Yes, there's a hand at the back there.
Hi. I've asked myself the question, as a British Muslim, why is all of this happening? And people in positions of power strengthening this anti-Muslim narrative. And kind of dawned on me the other day, maybe one of the reasons is that this kind of boogeyman is being nurtured, if you wish, and this country is being destabilized at the expense of people in power being able to play politics with this boogeyman that's being developed. That's the kind of one of the reasons, well, what I feel is one of the reasons this is happening. I wonder if you've got any comments on why this may have been happening, because I almost feel like this is being done at the, expense of destabilizing their own country. By their own country, I mean my country, our country. And it just doesn't make sense. You're almost destroying your own country, because millions of us, we're not going anywhere. The major urban centres of this country, that's where we're concentrated. So why are these people in power destabilizing their own country? I mean, in terms of myself, I've got a very interesting journey in terms of my own kind of views and beliefs and circles that I've mixed in, or opinions and views that I've had. And funnily enough, I've, I used to use your dinner table test to kind of speak to people and say, it almost feels like things have become normalized. And I didn't realize that it was actually your saying that you'd come out with. So, I mean, I've gone on a bit of a rant, but I almost feel if you could give your opinion on why this is happening, because it doesn't make sense. This country is being destabilized by this stuff happening.
Yeah. You know what's fascinating is that's the question that I get almost asked at every, and I'm doing dozens and dozens of these events, and I get asked at every single event, and it's always asked by a young Muslim. And it's interestingly, like I said, I've just finished the paperback, and the paperback finishes with, the last couple of sentences are, and the questions that we will keep asking is, who is dividing us and why? Who gains? And it's the question that I feel that I have not been able to join all the dots on. So the political answer is the one that I talked about earlier. I refuse to. If you imagine we are a family, and we all have people in our families who are, odd and problematic, and you try your best to accommodate the odd bod in the family, because constantly, you don't want to isolate them, you don't want to throw them out, you don't want to ostracize them, you don't want to leave them to, if this is the genuine kind of person who is either unusual or odd or even dangerous maybe, or violent. So you break this down into a family, and you break it down, but why would you then say, well, you're odd and you're bad and you're dangerous, and all your siblings are dangerous, and all your aunts and uncles are dangerous, and all your friends are dangerous, and all the people that you go to school with are dangerous. And you try and isolate the one person who might be problematic. You don't try and put them into an even bigger group and make that group even more isolated and then create a bigger problem for yourself. And so I have this constant issue when, I mean, I spent a lot of time in government dealing with the counterterrorism strategy, and I kept saying, you're feeding this, you're making this worse, you're not isolating. What you're not saying is, look, this is the problem, let's deal with the problem. What you're doing is, through your language and your policy making, you're adding more and more and more and more people into this tent of problem. And why would you do that? Because then you've got a bigger problem to solve. And I could never, even in government, you know, get a straight answer to say, well, this isn't working. I mean, prevent is a typical example. If you think about the number of people who are referred to channel, which is a tiny, tiny number of people, but then the hundreds of thousands that we sweep up in this massive net, most of them who should never be anywhere near that net, and then we end up ruining lives and destroying their futures, and then damaging everybody in their environment, and then toxifying the community in the process. Why are we doing that? Why are we self-harming in this way? And that's why I talk about that those people who are doing this are somehow projecting as patriots. You know, those people who are fighting these culture wars are projecting as people who care about this country. But if you cared about this country, like, for example, this is our family and we care about it, you wouldn't do this. You wouldn't be setting fires everywhere. So have I got a clear answer for you? No. Is there probably a third book? Yes.
Okay, now I'm going to stop because people who might want a signed copy of Sayeeda's second book ought to have a chance to go and buy it, and she ought to have a chance to relax, having had a long drive down here beforehand. But before I do, I just want to tell you about next week's talk, because people who are interested and concerned by the things that Baroness Warsi has been talking about may be interested in that one. It's a man called Luke Trill, who runs a think tank called More in Common. He's the director of More in Common. And what More in Common does is to use segmented data and public opinion research to understand, or to try to understand, divisions in society, and to try to counter them, and to work out how you can use data and the stories people tell themselves to break down division and find common ground and approaches to our shared challenges. So, talking about the state of public opinion, the rise of populism, and what we can do about it, I can't say that he is going to say it's all fine and let's all go out and sing Kumbaya together at the end either, because I'd say most people are pretty worried about this. But it is a very interesting topic. So it kind of follows on from Baroness Warsi's talk. If you're interested, 5:30 next week. But I just now want to thank you very much. Thank you, Guy and Julia, for the support to college. Thank you, Baroness Warsi, for a really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. And thank you all for coming.